everyone is rushing on.
That's what he said. It's like, well, 70th anniversary is worth going back home for.
Yes, but then he,
I know.
then he goes on to Colombia. But we are.
Priyanka, so this is for Somnathan. This is for this one here as well. So just put your email
Yeah, that's
in.
great. There's a cost.
That goes without question.
Then I am I have things to say. 6 papers in one presentation. What's the point of it?
Ask Abhinay to sit there. Get the other chap there. Abhinay, this corner. Rush. So good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Global Conclave 2024 on advancing human development in the Global South. This is the plenary session 4. That is the 4th plenary session of this Global Conclave, which is a panel on climate change, equity, and human development. This plenary session is being organized by Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. The chairperson of this session is Dr. Kirit Parikh. He's chairman, Integrated Research and Action for Development, IRADE, New Delhi, and former member, Planning Commission, Government of India. He's already on the dais. We welcome you, sir. The welcome and the opening remarks will be provided by Professor Alakhen Sharma. He's director of the Institute for Human Development, New Delhi, and also the conclave director. The theme presentation would be made by Professor Imran Valodia. He is Pro-Vice Chancellor and Director, Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. Panelists in this session are Aryan Dehan. He's Head, International Development Research Center, IDRC, Program Supporting Inclusive Growth, Ottawa. Professor E. Somanathan, Professor Economics and Planning Unit, Indian Statistical Institute, New Delhi. Professor Alin Halimat, Professor Alin, he is Professor, Department of Economics, University of Indonesia, Java Barat, Indonesia. Professor João Camilo Cardenas, Professor, School of Economics from Columbia. And special remarks would be provided by Professor Dr. Suman Berry. He's Vice Chairman, Niti Aayog, Government of India. He will join us soon. And the discussant in this session is Professor Beena Agarwal. She's Professor, Development Economics and Environment, Global Development Institute, University of Manchester, UK, and former Director of Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. I would request Professor Alakhen Sharma to please commence the proceedings of this session with his welcome and opening remarks. Not needed?
Welcome.
Okay, I now request Professor Kirit Parikh to take the reins of the session in his hand and kindly conduct the session. So would you need this hand?
Good morning, and thank you very much for asking me to chair this wonderful session. And I'm delighted to be here. The Institute of Human Development has done remarkable work over the years, and it's a fitting tribute to it that they've organized this whole program for the last 3-4 days, and even more for celebrating their anniversary in a wonderful way. So let me first say that since Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, Suman Berry, is going to be here, he will take some time. So from everyone, I think we will take a tax of Niti Aayog tax of 1 minute each. So you will speak for 14 minutes. Right. But to Beena Agarwal, she is the only woman on the stage. Oh, no, there are 2 one. Right. The 2 women will get 2 extra minutes each. So I think so that we can more or less keep in time. Now, I think that the issue here for this session is equity in human development. And the most important issue here is, equity has been at the center of all COP, Conference of Parties, in climate negotiations, at least from the side of developing countries, though it is not really particularly a focus of the industrialized countries. The CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities framework that was agreed to, does not really say at the same time how to allocate these responsibilities. I think, in a sense, the responsibility should be allocated, in my opinion, based on the total cumulated emissions people have made since 1990. Why since 1990? Because in 1990 the preparations for Rio conference, Rio Earth Summit started, and everybody became aware that there is an issue of climate change. So nobody can plead ignorance of not knowing that what they are doing is going to affect climate. So I think essentially from cumulative emission, and why cumulative emissions? Because it is cumulative emissions that cause global warming. And it does not depend on the flow, but of the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere that causes global warming. So I think that would be the good basis for deciding on what responsibilities are. Many people talk about co-benefits of climate action and urge India and other developing countries to take more active and climate action. However, I think co-benefits are all right, but we should also consider co-costs, because it is not as if that they come without any cost. For example, if India and I think South Africa too, both of them have coal as a major resource of their countries. Now, if they stop using coal, fine, it's one thing that some stranded assets take place. But on the other hand, a large number, millions of people in India depend on the coal mining, coal transport, and the ecology surrounding coal mines. So I think the impact on them could be disastrous if suddenly you are going to shut down coal mines. So I think one really needs to factor these kind of costs on human development into the strategy for climate change. I think the other issue is also talked about is green finance. Prime Minister Modi also suggested ask for green finance. I think we need to define and understand what do we mean by green finance. This is not just finance that is given for green projects at commercial terms, but green finance has to make sense, has to be finance at a long-term finance at a low interest rate. And therefore, one needs to work out ways by which, say, even the $100 billion that are being promised but not given are actually used for subsidizing interest rate so that green finance can really be multiplied many more times. And I think these, are some of the issues I hope the panel will address. And let me now say I look forward to the discussions and presentations from a variety of distinguished scholars from a large number of different countries and so on. Thank you.
My apologies. I thought I was at the end of the program.
Alak Sharma is the next one, I think.
No. I was to welcome him already. You already welcome. Yeah, I know. VC, I was supposed to welcome already.
Okay, fine. Well, I think I can restore that 1 minute text.
A bit of a misunderstanding. I looked at the program and I saw it. I was towards the end of it, so I didn't. I'm sorry to keep people waiting. And I'm here for 3 reasons. One is that Niti Aayog is a co-sponsor. I was at Vibrant Gujarat and got back very late last night. Apologies. But second, I don't miss any opportunity to hear, what Kirith has to say on climate change. He is the Dada and the Guru. And third, because WITS is a partner, and Imran and I go back a long way. So for all these reasons, pleased to be here, pleased to represent Niti Aayog, and I appreciate that. And I owed Alak many favors, and finally I've showed up in person. So with that, that's my 1 minute. Back to the program. Thanks. If I could have the program brochure, that would be nice.
I request now Imran to give his talk. He is going to give you
So my task here is just to make a few opening remarks about about the panel, but let me start by again expressing a huge congratulations to the IHD on its 25th anniversary. As I said in the conference event, I've worked with IHD for about half of its life, and that sort of really started when my university looked at what its relationships in the South were. We talk a lot about South-South relationships, and when we looked at what our relationships actually were, what was quite striking for us is that most of our relationships with universities in the global South were in fact articulated through an institution in the global North. And this kind of hub and this hub and spoke relationship was really what defined our relationship with institutions here. So typically what that would mean is that the funding would all go to an institution in the global North. The Indian institution would be asked to do something on India. The South African institution would be asked to do something on South Africa. The Ugandan institution would be asked to do something about Uganda. But the real thought and the real results and the resources about these projects typically ended up in institutions in the global North. So our relationship with IHD is really part of us breaking that relationship. And I think the panel that we've put up today is really part of that thinking. So what you have in this panel is countries from the global South sharing their experiences and their thoughts around climate change. And we in fact have two panels. So immediately after this one, there'll be a further panel, and it's technical panel 17. So the two panels really go hand in hand, and across those two, we have experiences which we'll start with through Aryan, looking at the international dimensions of this issue. We then have papers in this panel on India, on Indonesia, and Colombia. In the next panel, which is at 11:15, we'll have papers from South Africa, from Brazil, from Bangladesh, and again from India, and again from Indonesia. So across those 9 papers, you have 7 countries across the global South that are grappling with these issues of climate change and equity. I think I've almost completed my task. I just want to thank the IDRC, who have supported our center in South Africa to work on these South-South relationships and made it possible for us to have panels of this sort where we can share different experiences from the Global South. I also want to just say how pleased I am to share to kind of share this panel with Suman. So just a little story, kind of as I look kind of across the room, I've worked with a number of Indian colleagues in this room on issues of economics, employment, etc. But kind of Suman and I were part of a project that with kind of GMOL on trying to actually understand informal work from the perspective of informal workers. And we tried to do that through kind of actually trying to be an informal worker for a few days. So while I've done papers with quite a few of you in the kind of in the audience, I think it's only with Suman that I can say I've kind of tried to sell plants in kind of in an informal market in Oaxaca, and it's only with him that I've failed to kind of produce food that we could sell in informal markets in Durban. Just a final thought. I think these kind of issues of climate change are kind of absolutely critical for kind of questions of equity and kind of questions of human and kind of questions of human development. From what we know from the latest IPCC reports, if we stay on the trajectory that we're on, we're likely to end up with a rise in temperatures in the order of 3.3 to 5.7 kind of degrees Celsius, which is more than twice the target that we're aiming at. The kind of implications of that for human development, I think, are really frightening, and it's quite urgent that the human development agenda needs to quite seriously kind of start to look at these issues. So with that, I'll pass it back to the chair.
Thank you, Professor Valodia. May I now request Professor Arjun Dehan from IDRC to make his speech, 15 minutes. Beg your pardon? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Parekh. I want to thank the organizer. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Institute of Human Development. I think I'm partly here because I think I can say I've been a friend of IHD for 25 years. I'm waiting for the compliments that I look younger than I am. I want to thank Niti Aayog, of course, for being here. I've followed the leadership, including on the South-South Learning, and just a privilege to be here. And of course, colleagues at WITS, as Imran said, this work was part of work. It was led by my colleagues based in Africa. I'm now based with IDRC here in Delhi, working on a climate change program. So it was an enormous opportunity to be here. In my contribution, as Imran said, I've been looking at the evidence, the current evidence on the impacts of climate change, particularly on inequalities. And this underlines the many different ways in which climate risks disproportionately affect the poorest countries and poorest people. And I'll highlight that both the direct and the indirect impacts of those inequalities, including climate-induced disasters, long-term change in livelihoods, and the impacts of climate change responses and climate finance, as I think Professor Parekh already mentioned. There's both a shortage and an inequality in that climate finance as well. And I use the plural form, and I know this is a little bit too broad, the plural form of inequalities. There are many, but it is important that there are many forms and dimensions of inequality and forms of measuring these, as this conference has also highlighted. And I think it's critical a priori not to prioritize any of them. Dimensions of inequalities intersect, they are layered, and in the end, very important that poor people in poor areas, in poor countries are impacted more, we know that, but also differently. And it is very important that we bring that out in the research and in the policies on climate change. So first of all, and I want to do this very briefly, I'm developing a paper that's more detailed, and the direct impact of climate change on inequalities are very, very clear. There are at least 5 or 6 dimensions. I'll mention 2. If you look at rising temperatures and periods of not just the overall increase in temperature, but also the periods of extreme temperatures that India, as many other countries, have seen, and the burdens that are put on public health, agriculture, measures even of GDP. These impacts of climate change have very unequal dimensions. Poor people living in poor neighborhoods are likely more exposed to heat stress, less likely to protect themselves. Poorer, manual, informal laborers. I think the focus on the informal sector in a country like India, as many other countries, is really important. Informal sector and agricultural workers are much more likely to be impacted by those changes. And within that, and among the inequalities, I think and I hope to do this in an intersectional way, is the impact that this has on women, and particularly poor women is particularly important. Women, for example, in this context can face increases in hours of unpaid work, loss of income, in paid, particularly in manual jobs where they're overrepresented, and also the specific health burdens that they face. Global warming, of course, the second element, an example of the climate change is that global warming, of course, increases the risk of droughts, including mega droughts, long periods of droughts. The frequency of dry spells has significantly increased in many countries, including in India, and there are measures of the impact that has on GDP. Again, droughts, and to this audience, I don't need to spell this out, droughts impact more vulnerable disproportionately. Smallholder farmers tend to be disproportionately impacted. Access to water is often controlled by larger farmers, and failure of harvest against small farmers to sell off their lands. And the gender dimensions of that, again, intersecting, are very clear. I don't need to say that when I'm on a panel with Professor Agarwal, of course. There are many other aspects of climate change that we're very familiar with. The evidence is very, very clear, and each of these have the kind of inequality impacts that are illustrated in those two cases. Main point there is they are very significant, but importantly, the evidence also reminds us that this is not new. Neither is the evidence nor is the impact new, but that it's the preceding inequalities that tend to be reinforced, as well as that many of the negative impacts may be caused by those inequalities. So understanding those preceding inequalities, I think, is really, really important. So the second thing then, there are equally important risks of climate of the climate action, the responses to climate change on the impacts of inequalities, both in the policies for so-called adaptation and mitigations. The literature identifies potentially positive equality outcomes in some of those actions. For example, in carbon markets, for example, particularly perhaps in access to solar energy, to public transport, employment generation in what's called the green economy. And they are there. I want to make sure that I don't just emphasize the risk, but also the opportunities in those new policies. But I think the emerging evidence, that including in work supported by IDRC, indicates that such gains are contingent and dependent on compensatory measures and including measures to address gender barriers and norms. So let me try to illustrate that point. At the macro level, the move towards green economies and energies, despite hopes that these are cost effective, is led by developed economies. And it appears, I think it's clear, that this puts strains on the capacities of countries and regions that are dependent, I think it was mentioned, dependent on coal, oil and gas, and are effectively investing in what seem to be stranded assets. Bangladesh, for example, many countries illustrate that. India was mentioned with its coal, of course. Bangladesh seems to illustrate this very clearly, where, as an article said, it seems to be burning coal to survive climate change. As all economies, as all economic transition, this transition to so-called green economies implies significant changes in opportunities for different groups. Transitioning out of coal, of course, impacts mining communities, and beyond the challenge of miners in the so-called formal sectors, I think it's very important to look at the impacts also on people that are dependent indirectly on mining activity, beyond those informal employment, small enterprises, and again, there's very important gender dimensions in that as well. The gender dimensions of these transitions are very significant. Access to new green opportunities are constrained by well-documented barriers in STEM, education, and finance. Women tend to be less employed in activities like formal sector mining, but more represented in the informal activities. And advocates, I think, have rightly raised the concern in that in the debate on just transition, and of course the South African colleagues could speak to that, some of this clearly was biased towards male and unionized workers and ignoring, for example, gender impacts. Policies to promote green economies can have very significant inequality considerations. And again, there's opportunities. Reducing fuel subsidies can, of course, impact poorer groups disproportionately, but there are also very good examples internationally on how the savings from those subsidies are used for cash transfers for poorer groups. Impact on carbon markets, I think is a huge priority for research, and I'm keen to learn more about the Indian debate on this. Including because of the work on corporate social, the investment in corporate social responsibility. In principle, by buying carbon credits, companies, richer countries can fund climate action across the world, green energy, nature-based solutions, and this is a potential pro-poor. This is a very important pro-poor potential, but there are very important concerns, both in the way those carbon markets function itself, the lack of clear pricing, whether the projects funded are additional, and so on. But what I want to emphasize here, that the quality and impact of those projects have raised large concerns. And many of those concerns, if you come, and I think many people in the audience, you read the climate literature, these are the regular development and poverty concerns that people are focused on for a long time. Again, it's the preceding inequality that really matter. Not only are the emission reductions often overstated, but also many of the schemes can come with devastating impact, particularly for indigenous communities and local communities. A transition to clean energy is perhaps one of the most critical climate and simultaneously development challenges, particularly in contexts where many people do not have access to reliable energy sources. And we've done some analysis to see the potential that this has for gender equality and inequalities more generally. And then the evidence that we reviewed, one, shows that this transition is happening much more slower than expected, partly because of financing constraint, and I come to that in a minute. And with respect to gender, the evidence shows that women tend to be, for example, pigeonholed as consumers of energy, they are underrepresented in energy sectors, and they tend to lack access to finance in those new opportunities. And thus we conclude also with respect to transition to clean energy, which was had perhaps one of the biggest potentials for promoting equalities, that alongside addressing finance gaps and implementation gaps, tackling those systemic socioeconomic inequalities is central for making those energy transitions more inclusive. Finally then, climate finance was already mentioned. I think it's absolutely critical, also research priority is to think about how this reinforces inequality. To start with, of course, internationally, there's not nearly enough climate finance. Within that, though, if you look at how climate finance is distributed, it has a focus on adaptation rather than mitigation. That's the wrong way around. Of course, it has a focus on there's more money for mitigation than there's for adaptation. And the inequality concern around that is that poorer people are more heavily impacted by climate change and need more money for adaptation. And it's very clear that there is a bias towards mitigation activities, energy projects that have an easier return. Within that, again, the focus on expectations that private finance will fund needed climate action is also very critical in this context. First of all, the high expectations of available private finance have not been materializing globally. I don't know if it's the case in India, but globally, in fact, the last few years have seen a decline in new forms of finances. And importantly, for this context, the move to leverage private with public funding may have created a new poor bias in funding. As even blended finance requires financial returns, they make it less likely or harder to ensure this funding targets the needs of poorer groups. And finally, on that topic, I think there's very clear evidence, again, globally, for example, research by IIED, is that how hard it is for local communities to access that climate finance because of the way big funding operates. Again, it's harder for poorer groups to assess. So I've run through very quickly through at least three kind of aspects of inequalities in the context of climate change. And to wrap up, we all know climate change is impacting all countries, and the responses there internationally are not sufficient. And there is growing very clear evidence that this is hitting hardest the places and groups that are most vulnerable, already live in degraded geographies, and are least resilient. For our research community, I think it's important to stress that much is already known about climate change, and that translating this into policies is as important as translating this research into policy is as important as new research on the topic. And in particular, I think it's critical to focus on making sure that the evidence and data that are made available at local levels and for groups that need it most, and that there are very important examples of doing that. Finally, much research has already shown the unequal impacts of climate change. Documenting this will continue to be critical. As we know from our review on gender, the focus has been the direct impact of climate change, and documenting the potential inequalities in climate action remains an equal priority, and as I said, to do this from an intersectional perspective. Finally, very important to highlight that emerging inequalities are not attributed to climate change per se. They are not new. Structural existing inequalities determine to a large extent how those impacts are distributed and can be reinforced by climate action. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Professor Parikh.
Thank you very much. May I now request Professor Somnathan to.
So thank you very much, Professor Sharma and others for inviting me to be a member of this very distinguished panel. I'll just repeat. Thank you very much, Professor Sharma, for inviting me to be a member of this very distinguished panel. I think there's a feedback of some kind. Anyway, so I wanted to talk today about an aspect of climate change that is, I think, neglected and particularly with regard to the discourse on equity with regard to climate change. I think that discourse is focused largely on compensation for climate damages, the responsibility for which originates largely with wealthy countries and wealthy people in wealthy countries, and which is disproportionately borne by poor people in poor countries. And I think that although that's important, I think what is much more important and very neglected, in my view, is to try to protect these vulnerable people from the worst of the climate change. And I think that there is one thing that's really not been on the table for discussion about doing something about that, which could be done potentially, and that's what I want to talk about principally today. So, as we all know, right, climate change has set back development, but it's often framed in a way in which this is something that's going to happen in the future. What I want to emphasize first is to say that this is something that has already happened. It's not something in the future, it's something, in fact, in our past. So these are two very prominent studies by economists, which use cross-country data over many years, and they find a decline in GDP growth in hotter years. The first study finds it in poor countries, the second study in hot countries, and of course there's a large intersection between those two. We can also look within India, which is, relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the world, both a poor and a hot country, and we see this pattern replicated. So there's a study, recent study, which finds a decline in GDP growth of about 2.5% per degree increase in temperature using state-level data in India. And what I want to emphasize is that if you go back to the 1970s and up to today, the temperature in India roughly has risen by about a degree. Okay, so we are talking about something that has actually been seen. Okay, and this is state-level data. And the effect is larger for poorer states, and it's larger for agricultural output compared to other sectors. If you look at a more disaggregated level, at the district level in data in India, we find another study which finds a 3% decline in GDP growth per degree increase in temperature. And again, the effect is larger for poorer districts. This is a study I did with some co-authors, and we looked at manufacturing output at the district level. Again, we find something similar. If we go further down, further disaggregation from the district level in India to manufacturing plants using the annual survey of industries, we find the same pattern. Manufacturing output falls by about 2% per degree rise in temperature. Okay, this is in India. That's a picture from a garment plant in the national capital region. And if you look now, much more disaggregated. Inside some of these plants, we went and collected some primary data at the daily level. So we have temperature data from day to day, and we have a measure of worker output from day to day. And we see that when temperatures are higher, you look at the top left panel, that's the garment plants that we saw. When temperatures are higher, you get a decline in productivity in plants without climate control. If you look at the plants with climate control, you don't see that productivity decline. And similar, the bottom left panel, this is for cloth weaving plants in Surat. Again, garment plants in the top right. Then we also have the steel plant in Bhilai there. Because they have climate control, we don't see any impact of the outside temperature. Now, those are manufacturing plants, and the manufacturing industry workers are generally better off, better paid, better working conditions and so on. But they are not representative of the labor force in India, and they're not representative of the labor force in lower and lower middle income countries worldwide. So workers in the so-called informal sector constitute about 80% of the labor force in low income and lower middle income countries. And they're on average poorer and more vulnerable than those in formal manufacturing. So here I want to show you some data from a recent study which is under review now, which was done in the summer of 2019 in Delhi, and doing daily surveys of about 400 workers And what we find is a very large decline in worker earnings. So if you look at the blue, the light blue ones, they're looking at the effect on daily earnings of a day in which the temperature, and I have various temperature measures on the horizontal axis. Look at the extreme right one, that's wet bulb temperature, because that's the one that most closely corresponds to what people actually feel. It takes humidity and temperature into account. And you can see that the net earnings, which is the blue one, you see a 19% drop. That's the estimated effect of an additional degree of wet bulb temperature. Okay? So this is really a much, much larger effect than what we saw in the manufacturing sector or what we see in aggregate GDP. All right? Now, there's several reasons for this. One is that this was done only in the summer in Delhi, and so that's when it's hottest. So you would expect the largest effects then. And the second reason is that it's workers in the informal sector, and they tend to be less protected. The other thing that you might notice from this graph is the effect of maximum temperature is much smaller than the effect of minimum temperature. The loss due to minimum temperature is higher. So what that's suggesting is that it's the fact that poor housing conditions where you're not protected from heat at night have a bad effect on productivity. And there's more, and I don't have time to go into this here, but we have more evidence on that score. And this is not a small problem, okay? So it's true that Delhi in summer is hot, right? But there are about 320 million workers in the informal sector worldwide who are exposed to similar temperatures in at least 1 month of the year as the workers in the study in Delhi, all right? So this is not a small problem. And again, I want to emphasize, this is not a problem of the future. These effects that you're seeing here is something that has already been experienced. We've already had a 1 degree rise in temperature in India in the last 50, 60 years. Okay. So this income has already been lost, so to speak. Okay. So I wanted to say all this because I want to emphasize that there's a lot of evidence about economic losses measured in conventional economic money terms of temperature increase that has already happened. So if we extrapolate this a little bit, India's GDP is about $3 trillion US dollars. That's 3,000 billion US dollars. A 3% decline, therefore, is about a $90 billion loss annually. Okay? And the effect in richer and cooler countries is much smaller. For example, in the US, there's a study that estimates the effect is about 3%, 0.3%, 0.3% decline. But US GDP is a lot bigger, so that actual absolute damage is now about $75 billion annually for a 1 degree increase. And global GDP is about 100 trillion US dollars. So a global effect, and if we look at the US effect and we look at the Indian effect, we expect the global effect to be somewhere in between the 2% roughly in India and the 2 or 3% roughly in India and the 1/10 of that size effect in the US. And so maybe globally it's about 0.5 to 1%, right? If we just add that up in dollar terms, it's talking about between $500 billion and $1 trillion per year globally, every year, right? That's what we're losing because the temperature has already risen by about 1.3 degrees, okay, globally. And I also want to say that, to point out that that's a dollar loss, okay? But that dollar loss is distributed very unfairly also. Okay, the next thing I want to point out is that this, looking forward, it's going to get hotter. So we're going to get more degrees it's going to be even hotter, and so we can expect even larger effects. And things that perhaps we haven't seen that much of yet is conflicts and political instability arising from economic disruption, arising from climate change. And that can be economically disastrous because it can lead to the flight of capital and skilled labor from a country, right? And we see that that happens with any kind of economic crisis. The trouble with climate change is it's not an economic crisis that comes and goes. It's an economic crisis that comes and then it gets worse and then it gets worse and then it gets worse. It doesn't stop. So this is a point I've already just made. But here's the thing. even in the most optimistic scenarios for cutting emissions, the world will continue to warm for another 40 or 50 years, right? That's best case. Best case, if politically everything goes well, which is unlikely. And that means a rise in temperature of maybe 1.5 to 2 degrees, the top of the 1.3 degrees that we have already seen, okay? After that, the temperature will not decline. It will level off at that higher 2.5 to 3 degrees, higher than pre-industrial. And therefore, you will get this relentless, year after year, hammered by droughts, heat, and so on, right? Unless CO2 is removed from the atmosphere by chemical or other means, right? So people are talking about removing, people are talking about net zero. Why is that word net there for zero emissions? The word net there is because you're assuming that some CO2 will be pulled out to compensate for CO2 that's being emitted, right? And there are technologies which are sort of mostly not operational yet, which are supposed to do this. They're quite expensive. But the important thing is that the scale of the problem is very huge. So even if you develop these technologies and you get them to work, it's going to take a century or more than a century to get that CO2 out, all right? And what will happen to the most vulnerable people in the world? In the meantime, how can they be protected now, let alone in 1 decade or 2 decades or 5 decades? So I think that this is the part where I want to talk about something which usually doesn't get, in my view, enough attention in the discourse. So climate scientists anticipated that we, meaning the whole world, may dig ourselves into this hole. And the Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen, who was one of the people who discovered the ozone hole of Antarctica, pointed out that it's possible, essentially, to put reflecting particles in the upper atmosphere, and that would reflect sunlight to some degree, and that would offset, to some degree, the effects of the global warming from putting CO2 in the atmosphere. And so let me quote from what Crutzen wrote in his article. Again, I must stress here that the albedo enhancement scheme, that means enhancing the reflectivity of the atmosphere, should only be deployed when there are proven net advantages, and in particular when rapid climate warming is developing. Importantly, its possibility should not be used to justify inadequate climate policies, but merely to create a possibility to combat potentially drastic climate heating. So this was proposed basically as an emergency measure in case we failed to curb emissions sufficiently quickly. I think it's pretty clear in 2023 now that we have failed to curb emissions sufficiently quickly. And so we have to think about these drastic climate measures. But what happened after Crutzen wrote this? The first thing that global warming deniers did was to use the prospect of climate intervention, also called geoengineering, to justify inadequate climate policies. So exactly what he feared, that's exactly what happened. And economists, of course, were not far behind here. There's a popular, famous book co-authored by a famous economist suggesting that climate intervention should be done instead of, as a substitute for, rather than in addition to reducing emissions. And the effect of this was that discussing climate intervention became taboo in polite company. If you talked about it, you were on the bad side, on the dark side. Okay. But unfortunately, we are now got to the point that Crutzen anticipated, that the only way that we can actually protect the poor and not just, talk about compensation is by doing some of this. It is feasible. It's economically very, very cheap. Okay, very, very cheap. It a little bit would slow the rate at which warming is happening, and it would pose very little risk of changing climate patterns in ways that would make any part of the world worse off. A little bit more, if you did that, that would be enough to prevent a further rise in temperature. Even more, if you did even more of it, you could reverse some of the warming that has already happened, right? And therefore some of the damage that's gone with it. And as we've seen, that damage is quite large. There is an associated risk, and the principal one is of side effects such as droughts in some areas that would otherwise not have occurred. And the uncertainty about this rises with the amount of this intervention that you do. If you do a very little intervention, then it's quite predictable. If you do a lot, it becomes more uncertain what the effects will be. So in my opinion, some amount of climate intervention will become unavoidable in the near future just because things are getting worse, and they're getting worse fast. And therefore, it's better to research it now on an urgent basis, because we should be prepared to do it ahead of time and think about it ahead of time rather than blunder into it into a panic. It will require a new framework for international cooperation. How much of this climate intervention to do will be a deeply contested political decision. And it's better to start thinking about it now rather than being rushed into it in an emergency. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Somnathan, for a very, very instructive and informative speech. May I now request Dr. Suman Berry, VC of Niti Aayog, to give his speech. Since he has to leave early, I'm requesting him to speak now, but he will stay here for the remaining two speeches.
Thank you very much, Kirit. I indicated, as it were, the imperatives that made it incumbent on me to be at this session today, of respect for the Institute of Human Development, which I've known since Deepak Mazumdar, I think, founded it, and of course my very old friend and colleague Deepak Nair now heads the Institute. But also, I have to say, the IDRC. The IDRC was very good to the NCAR through the medium of the think tank initiative. More recently, we had a G20 conference, which IDRC at short notice financed, and some of the comments I'm going to make not perhaps only about the session about the topic of this session, but more broadly about the importance of this conclave. Reflects what took place at that event, which I'm told by Amitabh Kant actually was useful for the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, and which we have now put out as a conference proceedings as a transition to the Brazilian chair. I don't know if there are, I didn't see in the program whether there are people from Brazil here, but as somebody who worked on Brazil for some years, I am very pleased that this conclave has been put together. As you know, or some of you, as the Indians in the room know, Niti Aayog, the institution that I am honored to lead on behalf of our chair, the Honorable Prime Minister, is a successor to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission, on which Kirit had a very distinguished, role, had as its output 5-year plans, very detailed 5-year plans, very thoughtful 5-year plans. Essentially, that has been the time horizon within which, as it were, Indians have thought of the long term. That's not quite true. There was a perspective planning division, but I'm not absolutely sure what its time horizon was. The important point I want to make is that between, as it were, the Paris Agreement and a challenge that the Prime Minister put before the nation in 2022 at the commemorating 75 years of India's independence, was that India should aspire to become a developed nation in the next 25 years. Now, there's a lot embedded in that formulation. What does development mean, on what dimensions? The point I simply want to make is that both in respect of this aspiration for the nation and in terms of commitments that countries are being asked to make
within the COP framework, including a net zero target, we have a need and a reason to think longer term than has been customary in the Indian system. Okay, so as we engage in this process of reflection, and given the fact that Niti Aayog has been charged, I was charged as the job was offered to me, that the main arena for Niti Aayog is the states. The formulation by the Honorable Prime Minister is that India doesn't grow, India grows when states grow. And so the whole subnational dimension of the issues we're talking about here become very important. I was for 4 years in The Hague, where I think Ayan taught, and Ashwini Seth, I think, was in the program as well, as the chief economist of Royal Dutch Shell. And there we tended to, I became aware of the EU as a articulated unit, and yes, the EU has common policies for climate change, but really, if you were to talk about labor markets, development strategy, as between Latvia and Cyprus, you wouldn't believe that one size fits all. And so I think part of the challenge for India, for Niti Aayog, is to think of these issues in a articulated way across India's states. And so with Indonesians in the room, with South Africans in the room, with the diversity of climatic and other endowments across South Africa, for example, I do want to say that for these large G20 members from the South, and some not in the G20, like Nigeria, thinking about these issues at a more local level is extremely important. And this then, comes to the point that Som has made. So, there was the, there was the work done at ICRISAT and also with NCR, Mark, sorry, my memory's failing me, but really there were the ICRISAT studies about how households dealt with, how communities dealt with shocks, and what is the difference between climate change and idiosyncratic shocks. There was also the issue, the discussion on if Chile were Texas or Texas were Chile. The point being that in a large federal country, it may well be that some of the climate-induced shocks can be distributed through the country, and we need to think about the fiscal and resilience frameworks for that. But the point I want to make is that why climate is different is something that we need to think about in the context of a large federation. And for me, that then becomes the question of what should be the welfare unit around which we should be thinking in a 25-year horizon. I can tell you that the Honorable Prime Minister clearly thinks in terms of existing jurisdictions. As I said, he says that when states grow, India grows, and clearly the political structure reflects spatial the spatial organization here and everywhere else. But is the response to climate change, the spontaneous response to climate change, going to be large-scale migration? Certainly we know that the energy transition does mark a fundamental shift from what in a sense one can call India's Appalachia in the east to the solar endowments to the west, which are already the richer parts
of the country. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Should we wish people to stay where they are? We already have, as Chinmay Tumbe has pointed out, large, if undocumented, seasonal migration. So I think the question of, over a 25-year horizon, what should be the policies and what should be the framework of thinking in a large federation about why climate change is different from weather shocks or disasters is something I hope that this conference will ruminate on and provide insight on. Let me, because I'm very keen to hear the other presentations, just make three final points. One is that one of the insights that came from the G20 conference, and I think this may have been Jessica Seddon, it may have been, I don't think it was Robert Stevens, they did say that one of the dimensions of climate, and some would know about this, is actually complete reversals in weather patterns. So drought areas become rainy regions become drought. Now, that is obviously a pretty big deal. And the question is, what does the research tell us about that? But the second point was that, and this takes me back to my shell scenarios kind of training, which is that it's not clear that our bureaucratic and institutional structures are set up to be flexible. I know that one of the complaints of the states when I go to them is that our centrally sponsored schemes are very rigid, and what it means to bring in flexibility in government programs while maintaining accountability, I think is going to be one of the challenges for the bureaucracy. I do think that that for a country like India, we could be waiting for the French Foreign Legion in terms of external finance to come forever. Not sure that it ever will, even though there's a lot of piety about this being a collective global good. And so a lot of, as it were, the both the adaptation and the investment dimensions of adaptation are likely to involve serious fiscal reprioritization, and fiscal reprioritization where the usual tax handles of fossil fuels may be dwindling. So I think thinking about fiscal reprioritization so that safety nets that are needed to provide for the rigors of climate change, the resources are there, and that of course raises an issue that's come up in the trade literature. Deepak has written about this, which is both from a political economy point of view and otherwise, ought you to be providing, as it were, relief for specific shocks, or should you have overall social safety nets? A lot of the people who argue for carbon taxes say that one of the benefits of that is that you then have a pot of money which can compensate people for the increase in fuel prices. But if this is going to be a permanent shock, should we be thinking of a larger framework for income support? And finally, with Bina on the panel, let me just say that what has already come up in the discussion about the gender impact of climate and indeed of the next 25 years, whether formality is actually gender positive, not gender positive. I know South Africa is a country which has a large formal labor force and yet has tremendous problems of unemployment. So whether the greater flexibility of informality is something that actually will help in the challenging decades ahead, I think is another issue I'd like to put before this very interesting conclave. Kenneth, thank you, and let us move on to the others so I can hear from our foreign guests.
Thank you, Suman. May I now request Professor Halimat Sadia. I don't know how to pronounce this correctly, but please.
Where?
Do you have the PPT? May I send it? You want pen drive to send? You have sent it to the email.
Yeah.
Email.
But I have the request person, so I hope
If
I
you
can.
can just send it to my pen drive.
You already downloaded it.
Thank you.
Which one? The other ones.
Where is that? No. I have the revised version.
The required version of this?
Maybe.
About this. The standard one.
I think I have the revised version.
Just turn it.
No. Yeah, just let me. Just the first. Where is it? Here.
Since you have started,
Okay.
This is the.
No, this is the first version, but it's okay. I can skip.
I have another meeting.
So how to share it?
I'm afraid I will.
You need to just scroll down. Using this.
Oh,
I usually
cannot
come just for this.
share
You
screen?
like it? I just-
Full slide?
It is already done.
No, I said, are you here just for this? Okay.
Okay, good morning, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to say happy anniversary to IHD, and it's been a pleasure for me to be invited in this event. This is actually my previous version, so I have many slides here, but I will skip some of the slides. So in this presentation, I would like to raise the issues of adaptation and how implementing adaptation action or strategies in developing countries can be challenging. It is well known that we have two responses to climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is how we reduce the drivers of climate change, which is greenhouse gas emission, while adaptation is how we can cope with climate change impact. Mitigation is about the future, adaptation is about the present. Most of my work is actually related to mitigation action, particularly on energy transition. So this is actually the first time I analyze this adaptation in a more comprehensive way, so I apologize if there are some shortcomings in my presentation. I realized that adaptation is more related to human development than mitigation, because mitigation is about making things to reduce emission, but adaptation is how to deal and build resilient society, and it places human well-being at the center. Adaptation is very relevant in developing countries, but adaptation is lacking in many ways. It is under-discussed, it is under-researched, and it is under-financed. So this presentation want to give an initial analysis on how the complexity of executing adaptation action. I will use Indonesia case, which I believe we can generalize the issues as Indonesia. Maybe some of the significant things raised in Indonesia also happen in the global south. Okay. Scholars around the world has been conducted a lot of estimation on the impact of climate change. One of them is the impact to the GDP. This figure shows how climate change impacts GDP globally and how the global south potentially suffer more, around double than global average. And if we look at the impact is locked for the next 10 years and maybe the next 20 years. So we almost can do nothing to respond to this impact. But we can reduce the impact of the climate change if we have a more ambitious climate adaptation action. So understanding climate impact could be challenging because of its complexity. We can differentiate two kinds of impact, technical impact and welfare impact. And to connect the two, we need to understand the channel. And the impact can be different across region, across income groups, gender, age, and other socioeconomic classification. And each disaster type has its own specification. For example, like storm is a fast onset, while drought is a slow onset. And it needs different speed of response. The impact can be different and need different adaptation measures also. So for example, we need to build stronger house for storm, or we need to have weather insurance for farmers for drought. So welfare impact come up at different forms. The impact can be loss of asset, either private asset or public asset. Private asset can be productive or non-productive asset. Productive asset can be linked to the livelihood of the people. So different type of asset need different responses, including who should finance the recovery of the asset. Loss of productivity of human can be caused by injuries or illness. Sectoral productivity loss can be in the form of reduced crop yields or increasing cost of catching fish, for example. So channeling the drivers to the impact can be tricky, particularly if we need to ensure the net impact, because there are so many confounding factors. So regarding the channel, there are some examples here. Droughts reduce crop yield, which is potentially followed by higher food price, and household can reduce or reallocate consumption because of this. Another example is asset damage, where the household need to recover the asset through reinvestment. Again, it will reduce consumption. Higher temperature potentially reduce work hours because workers need more break time. It can reduce productivity and earnings. Again, it will reduce consumption. So one of the important aspects of welfare to be evaluated here is lower consumption because of the drivers mentioned previously. Okay, now we move to the second part of my presentation, where I want to raise the issue of climate adaptation in Indonesia. So Indonesia is one of the G20 countries which aim to become a rich country before 2045. Sorry. Indonesia is a very diverse country in terms of language and ethnicity. It is an archipelago country where 70% of population live in the coastal area and 7 million of people depend on the livelihood on the ocean. With 280 million people, most of people work in the informal sector, and among that number, almost 90% of informal workers work in the agriculture sector. About 30% of the labor force work in the agricultural sector, including fisheries, which only contribute 12.5% of the GDP. and the poverty in these sectors are much above the national average. So the climate impact is real. There is an increasing trend of disaster events in Indonesia, particularly climate-related disaster such as flood, extreme weather, and drought. So this is my first attempt to analyze the challenge of adaptation action in Indonesia. I use three-level framework by Gradwick and Eberhard. The framework categorized the issues into three levels: country level, program, and project level. So at the country level, we identified 4 issues. First is about planning. In all climate documents we identified so far, the coverage of adaptation is less than mitigation. In addition to that, most of the planning document is not translated into more workable document or regulation, which is potentially not translated into proper budgeting. The second is coordination problem. In Indonesia, there are at least 16 ministries and agencies work on this climate adaptation. And the focal point is the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, which is actually adaptation is beyond their capacity. So mitigation gain more attention by this ministry rather than adaptation. Another problem is poor coordination with local government, which is crucial in adaptation case. For many mitigation projects, central government can handle that. For example, building many renewable energy project, a big project, yeah. But adaptation need action at the grassroots, and contextualization of action is very important. Next is lack of awareness of climate adaptation in any levels and any group of society, including policymakers. The climate literacy is already low in Indonesia, and even more for adaptation. Once I reviewed the process of climate budget tagging, so this officer from one ministry, they have difficulties in categorizing which program belongs to adaptation. Yeah, so I think this represents a lack of knowledge of adaptation. So the last is lack of priority for adaptation. Why this happen? Most likely because we don't know the magnitude of the damage. This represented by improper budget allocation, where money goes to unproductive and less important item, but politically favorable. Yeah, in Indonesia, a quarter of government budget goes to energy-related subsidy. At the program level, there is a data gap problem. Data is very essential and become necessary condition for good planning and effective project implementation. We need to know what kind of impact to welfare, where and who get the impact. We need to know how is the mechanism from the drivers to impact happen, and this mostly need a sophisticated study to know those response function. And sometimes we need high level of details, and combining many data formats such as geospatial, remote sensing, satellite, and other kind of big data, you name it. We need to have a proper level of granularity to make adaptation program targets the right beneficiaries. Next is poor program design and delivery. This is because we have limited knowledge on the problem and limited menus or choices of action. There are many combinations of action because different group of society need different adaptation techniques. Climate disaster makes the mobility of people moving into and out of poverty is fast, and we need to have real-time data to provide adaptive social protection. In adaptation, the choices of technology is so many, and sometimes still unknown. Yeah. For example, to reduce disaster risk from tsunami, we can either build man-made seawall from concrete, nature-based solution by planting mangroves, or combined with a spatial planning, like moving away people from the coastal area. In this case, we need to consider the voices from the locals and what kind of technology needed to solve that purpose, and whether the technology can be initiated from the grassroots. Another problem regarding the technology is how to spread the technology to be adopted locally. In mitigation, in electricity sector, for example, usually big firms who lead and adopt the technology. But in adaptation, spreading the technology to the grassroots can be challenging. This term is difficult to digest and have many options of indicators. Choosing the right indicators is important to guide policy for better action in the future. This is my last slide. At the project level, we have to answer several questions. First, what should be financed? As I mentioned before, different groups need different responses, and the issue is financing is actually twofold. Where we should find the money, but more importantly, where is the project? We are lacking of good project to be financed. Mostly the proposal comes from NGO, CSO, indicating lack of initiative from the impacted parties. It needs a concerted effort to have a say on what they need. We need to promote inclusive approach in developing adaptation project. Another problem is underdeveloped strategies of adaptation finance. So far, most of adaptation projects financed by public funding. The key is to understand level of commerciality of each project. It will guide us to what strategies needed to leverage the fund. The last thing I want to point out for the project level problem is inadequacy in resilient infrastructure investment project. Building a resilient infrastructure is more costly, but more durable, and it costs less to maintain. We need to take into account all of this benefit into the financial calculation, but the problem is the myopic behavior of the politician can be another problem to be handled carefully. I want to conclude my presentation. Let me stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Halimat Suhadia. May I now request Professor Juan Calvo Cardenas to give his speech.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Gary and Imran for organizing or inviting me to this panel. And I hope that I can contribute a little bit to some of these issues that have been presented in the previous notes. And this might be a little bit complementary, because I want to bring this down to the micro level, to the behavior of individuals, but how the behavior of individuals aggregate to the larger scale. And with that in mind, let me start because I want to be on time within schedule. And I just want to stress 2 or 3 things that are key to the climate change challenge these days. Many of these have been already said by many people in different ways. Even my predecessors have stressed this in one way or another one, but these vast asymmetries that we face these days, I think are important to understand the collective action problem that we face at the global scale, at the planetary scale. And one of these asymmetries is the fact that most of the responsibility for the emissions that have created climate change have come from global north economies and industrialized nations mostly, whereas most of the vulnerabilities are within the domain or the impacts of the global south in poorer nations. Now, I want to qualify this because these days not only we need to talk about global north and global south, but also the global rich and the global poor. Within the global south nations, we have the rich also living with standards of living that many people enjoy in the global north, and at the same time, some industrialized nations in the global north are beginning to face or still face some disparities, and then you have people within global north nations suffering the consequences in a more dire way, in this case because of poverty and the threats of climate change. But having said that, these vast asymmetries are going to make complicated the problem of collective action. Within that, and because of that, we have very unequal power dynamics in how we can reach agreements, how we make investments, how we take action. And yes, at the global scale, we have had the Montreal Protocol that has been capable of solving the ozone layer problem that is a global scale problem, but at the same time, the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Agreements are still pending in terms of showing us that we can cope with this problem at the global scale. And both were within these asymmetries, even within the protocol the Montreal Protocol, there were asymmetries between the industrialized nations that had the technologies that were causing the chlorofluorocarbons to be emitted to the CFCs to be emitted into the atmosphere. And also the solutions had to involve these vast asymmetries in terms of who had the access to technology and the transition towards non-threatening mechanisms and industries for that. This, of course, is a very rough summary, but what I want to stress is that these unequal power distributions are going to affect the possibility of collective action. And finally, and this is going to be a lot of the focus of what I want to stress here, is that recently we are seeing this shift towards making individuals responsible. By that saying, humans, individuals, households should be the ones making the change. And this has been happening throughout the planet, in the global north and the global south, in terms of all these campaigns for energy saving, changing your consumption of patterns, electric mobility, CO2 compensations and offsets, and in general, this idea of the nudges. And to me, I think that's problematic, not only to me, but to several other people. I want to start with a simple paper that came out in Nature Climate Change recently that I encourage you to read. And this is a paper where they did this in different experiments with a survey type of experiment with people from different parts of the world. The idea of looking at support for a carbon tax. And what they found with different designs, I don't have time to get into the details, with different designs, what they found is that in general, when humans were invited to have the possibility of behaving through a nudge and more or less feeling good about it, it decreased, it eroded the support for a carbon tax, right? And what you see in these graphs is that in the vertical axis, in both the left panel and the right panel, and these are two of the main graphs of the paper, vertical axis is the support for the carbon tax. And when people were presented with the tax only, there was some kind of somewhere between 60 to 70, 75% support for a carbon tax. But when they had been presented either before or along with an energy nudge, the probability of supporting a carbon tax decreased. And this is problematic in many ways, because this idea that these individual actions and the pressure to make households and individuals throughout the planet responsible to create change and to accumulate change so that we can stop the level of emissions that create climate change may be eroding the possibility of creating more structural changes. And this is the point that Nick Chatter and George Lowenstein made in this recent paper that created a lot of fuss, a lot of debate among the behavioral community and the experimental community, of which I belong to. And this paper was quite interesting because what they did was to lay this out with the framework of an I-frame type of interventions, which is this nudges type of interventions to make individuals responsible for making changes, as opposed to the S frame, which is the frame that invites interventions at the structural levels. So the carbon tax would be more like an S-frame type of intervention because it's impositive, it's binding, and everybody should comply with it. And the I-frame would be more like voluntary on the individual side. So let me make more precise what they mean by this. But before that, also give you some recent evidence. This is a paper published in Econometrica a year ago, 2 years ago, where they collected a huge amount of data from nudges and RCT interventions throughout the world. And this accumulated somewhere around 23.5 million individuals behaving in these interventions, in these RCTs, that were based on nudges. Nudges for different reasons, health-wise, climate change, energy saving, consumption, and the like. And what they found is that in general, the effects of these nudges were very small. In economic terms, even if they were statistically significant, the economic size of the effect of these nudges were very small. In fact, when you compare the left-hand side panel to the right-hand side panel, the right-hand side panel shows a scaling up of more laboratory or experimental type of papers that were published in academic journals. That's the left-hand side panel. And in the right-hand panel is more like the nudge units that have been implementing and scaling up all these nudges. And basically what you see there is that for most of the cases, the effects are very small. So we come to the question, focusing on climate change, that if these nudges have very small effects or null effects, and yet we're making all this emphasis in making humans responsible for things that are creating climate change, we may be trapped or away from thinking about the structural changes that we need in society. And that was one of the points that Chatter and Lowenstein did in this paper about the I-frame and the S-frame. So let me define those precisely because this is at the core of what I want to say. By I-frame, they mean the neural and cognitive machinery that underpins their thoughts and behaviors. So that's the definition. I'm quoting here the paper. This is what they call about the I-frame, those neural and cognitive mechanisms that make people behave. Whereas in the S-frame is the system of rules, norms, and institutions by which we live. And what they mean by I-frame policies with all this nudging is that in fact these nudges are cheap, they are quick, and they are politically less contentious because they don't step on people's toes. So they seem to be voluntary. I mean, this is the whole thing about nudging, the idea of paternalistic libertarianism. And because they're cheap, they're quick, and they're politically less contentious, they are easier to implement. But what we're seeing from the evidence is that the impact is very small. But we're focusing a lot on this. So we see campaigns from the private sector, the government sector, the social sector, everybody pushing for all these behavioral changes, but the effects in general seem to be small. So we may be distracted from the bottom line, and the bottom line is how do we make changes in the structures? And notice, history has shown us that most of the changes that happen in society have happened because of S-frame interventions, not I-frame interventions. And these I-frame interventions, as I said, have shown very small or null results. But further, the point is that these I-frame interventions may be delaying or distracting us from the possibilities of changes in the structural level, in the big policies that are binding, that are mandatory, that are pressing the structures of the market and the functioning of the government to make changes. So this excessive focus on the I-frame in the bottom line of the graph and paying less attention to the S-frame might disconnecting the possibility of these structural changes. And the question is, how do we get then collective action within that framework to push from the bottom up towards these S-frame interventions? And the C-frame is the proposal that I have for that. So to this idea of the I-frame and the S-frame, I'm going to place in between as a bridge what I would call the C-frame. C-frame because of communities, because of collective action, because of cooperation, and because collective action has shown historically that it builds institutions. Collective action creates social norms, it creates structures, it creates patterns of behavior by creating norms that bind people together and stop people from deviating via ostracism and social punishment and monitoring and sanctioning. Also because by constraining individuals, maintains the goal of the group, and they aggregate processes, and this is the point that I want to make in my last few minutes. They aggregate the process to create a political cloud from the bottom up, and I will mention a few examples on that. So this C-frame idea is the bridge between the I-frame and the S-frame, and this is where formal institutions meet individual action. And I'm going to show you a few examples on that, so let me jump to that. And I'm going to mention only 4 quick examples, many of which might be familiar to you. One of them is the well-known case of the women's war in Nigeria in the 1930s. I will mention a little bit of each of these in a second. The second one is the decline of food binding in China that lasted for 1,000 years and then disappeared within 1 generation. The other one is something that is probably better known in India, is the Chipko movement on saving forests by women's groups in different parts of the country. And then finally, an example that is probably less known to you, the titling of collective land of about 6 million hectares in Colombia because of the pressure of black communities, former slave descendants, who moved to the forest and organized to pressure for a constitutional reform. And these 4 cases have this idea within this framework that I'm putting here, in the column of the C frame at the collective action level, key processes, mechanisms that used the I frame, the individual behavioral foundations, in group identity, in-group, out-group bias, pro-social preferences, all these things that we know today about human behavior, that changed the S-frame outcome. So in the case of women's war, they ended up pressuring the British rule to dismantle this mechanism of the warrant chiefs. These warrant chiefs were men that were selected by the British colonial system to govern Nigerian villages, ignoring that women were key in the political processes within villages. And the women began to protest, and eventually the British began to dismantle these warrant chiefs' institutions. In the case of food binding, the creation of these natural feed societies created clubs of families within communities to begin to agree on dismantling food binding, so that families would agree that their girls would be eligible to marriage without having to bind their feet, and eventually the practice disappeared. In the case of the Chipko movement, it started with this social protest by these different women, and at the end this ended up influencing a lot what Indira Gandhi did with the Forest Conservation Act, and eventually the banning on commercial logging in many of these indigenous communities. And finally, this case in Colombia that I mentioned, in which these communities ended up pushing a constitutional reform that mandated the government to title 6 million hectares to these communities in the Pacific coast of the forest in Colombia. There are many other cases that could be studied within this framework. I'm not going to go into them, but slavery abolition, women's suffrage, and the like are all these movements that I'm beginning to identify where these bottom dynamics of collective action within groups begin to create cloud pressure to change the S system. So if I want to wrap up, in a sense, what I want to do is the following. Think of nudges as these little pushes in the blue knot in the graph. But if the pushes are too small, because we're finding that the effects are too small, we're not going to climb up that hill, so that we go to a better equilibrium in the green dot, which is a better stable equilibrium that we would like. So the idea with all these movements and these examples that I have given is how networks of networks, from a small community that organizes and another one, and they begin to share information, and they begin to change and begin to create the cloud for changes from the bottom up. You might climb that hill and end up in the better equilibrium up there, and that's the point. So back to the large collective action problem, what I'm trying to say is, we have a problem of narrative. I'm not going to go into the detail, but I want to plant this idea in your head. Economists have created 3 stories that are just terrible ideas: the prisoner's dilemma, the tragedy of the commons, and the free rider problem. And all economics textbooks teach people that basically cooperation should not happen. And they're just bad narratives. Why? Why I say they're bad? Because the evidence we have from the laboratory, from the MRI scans, from the brain, from field experiments to lab experiments, from surveys and from history, is that humans have always cooperated. So we need to change this narrative. And Ostrom, of course, Elinor Ostrom and many others have shown that this is possible, that it can happen and it can be robust. But we need to change this narrative that it shouldn't happen. Because otherwise, this is going to affect the possibility to create cooperation within communities and aggregation of communities so that the bottom-up process changes the structure, and history has shown this, that has happened in the past, and I just told you 4 quick examples that in a paper that I'm writing are going to be well developed. So that's the idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cardenas. May I now request Beena Agarwal to make her presentation. She will take exactly 17.5 minutes.
I don't know. Can you close it?
That's what she said.
Do I need this? Yeah. Nature just gave me 5 feet too. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. 2023 was the hottest year on record, we are told, even if 2024 started with a cold wave. So welcome to climate change. And I'm really happy to be in this panel with people I've known for long years. Just before this session, Cardenas, Somnathan, and I were reminiscing that the last time we were together was in 2001, 3 weeks after 9/11 at a conference in Santa Fe. So in my comments, they're really excellent presentations. We've had 5 presentations, including Dr. Berry's. I will comment on 4. And I will separate my comments into 2 parts. The first part is on the impact of climate change, and the second is on the solutions offered. Now, both are very large topics, and understandably, these papers cover only some aspects of either. So first on impact. Now, both Arvind Dahan and Dr. Allen speak of climate change, the impact of that on inequalities in quite a range of complex terms. They mention heat waves, drought, rainfall variation, storms, and so on. And these, they emphasize, have unequal impact, both between countries, the global north and global south, and within countries between the rich and poor, and also intersectionally by gender. Now, in contrast to that, we have Professor Somnathan's particular focus on heat and rise in temperatures. So I will begin with that. Now, he presents strong evidence from a range of studies, including his own, on the negative effect of temperature rise on worker productivity and earnings, as also GDP. And I want to focus especially on the latest paper he shared with a couple of slides, since it provides, I believe, an entry point into a larger discussion. Now, in this recent co-authored paper, he assesses the impact of extreme heat on the earnings of urban informal sector workers. And it's a follow-up on his excellent 2021 co-authored paper on the impact of high temperatures on productivity of the manufacturing sector workers. Now, detailed empirical studies on climate change impact in diverse contexts, I believe, are extremely important, and we don't have enough. So Som's work and that of others he cites are very welcome. Now, focus particularly on the informal sector is extremely important because, as we know, the bulk of workers in the global south are located there, often occupying the most precarious jobs. And the paper shows that earnings fall due to a rise in wet bulb temperatures for workers living in 2 slums in Delhi. These workers cover 20 occupations, which are aggregated in the paper. Now, this work is an important addition to the growing literature on the impact of heat on earnings loss, but it also reveals some of the challenges and complexities of measuring impact of temperature rise on informal sector workers, and the need and what we might gain from disaggregation. So I believe there are 3 challenges in particular. First is that informal workers cover a diversity of occupations which have differential exposure to heat. Second, this diversity can vary by gender. And third, informal workers often diversify their jobs, just as we diversify our portfolios, either individually or as families. And tracking earning effects, therefore, can be extremely complicated. So let's consider first the urban informal sector, and then I'll come to the rural. According to a very useful 2022 statistical note by Vigo, Delhi has 4.92 million informal workers, and urban India has 119 million. The largest percentage of these workers in Delhi and in urban India do home-based work. This is followed by transport, construction, domestic work, and street vending in that order. Now, being indoors, whether you do home-based work or you do domestic work, these jobs are likely to be less exposed to extreme heat relative to, say, outdoor construction or transport work. If you're a vegetable vendor, it would be affected also by the perishability of your produce, and because you just can't leave your produce lying unguarded while you take shelter. So the effect of heat on earnings will depend greatly on the nature of work. Also, there are notable gender differences in informal jobs. So in Delhi, the majority of women informal workers are domestic workers, followed by home-based work. So we would expect their earnings to be less adversely affected by heat than men's. This is different from the usual gender effect we emphasize. Basically, what I'm saying is that differentiation by occupations and gender are key for assessing the impact of heat on earnings, plus several jobs can be held by the same person or household. Now, another key differentiation is, of course, the rural and urban. So both in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other parts of the global South, large percentage of informal workers are rural, especially in agriculture. Now, agriculture requires workers to spend long hours toiling outdoors, and these are also among the poorest workers since they are reliant on farming and many are landless. So there was a Lancet 2023 countdown report which assesses that in Asia, agriculture is the most affected by heat-related loss of labor earnings, followed by construction, and services are less affected, somewhat. And agriculture would constitute something like 70% of the potential earnings lost due to heat exposure as a proportion of total GDP lost in Asia. We know that in India, something like 60% of workers are still in agriculture, and Dr. Allen gave a figure of 89% for Indonesia. And this is also gendered. So for instance, in India, 75% of rural women workers are dependent on agriculture. So while focusing on informal workers is the right priority, for more generalizable results, we need also a focus especially on agriculture. And of course, a much more disaggregated analysis of urban workers, informal workers would help. Now, this is important for framing appropriate responses. Of course, SOM offers us an overarching global response, which is stratospheric aerosol injections, and who can disagree with that? But I think, meanwhile, a lot of policymakers also need local solutions. So let's consider what the papers have to say on solutions. And I would like to, I'd like to suggest that it's helpful to look at solutions from the lens of three criteria in the context of inequality. Firstly, the solution should reduce and not increase inequality. Secondly, they should prioritize sectors that affect the most people. And thirdly, they should be innovative and outside the box. Now, none of the papers, of course, suggest solutions that fit all three criteria, but some point to particular directions, which I'll refer to. And also, I'll bring in a couple of illustrative examples of my own. Now, the first criteria I mentioned, reduce and not increase inequality. We need this criteria because in practice, what we are seeing today is an increasing examples of green solutions that exacerbate inequality and adversely affect the vulnerable. Now, Aryan gave a couple of examples. He talked about how RED Plus had negative effects. RED Plus was used for reforestation. There are other mentions, subsidies, coal. I think Suman mentioned issue of coal. But consider a really more graphic example, which is from energy transitions, which none of the papers discuss, but that's okay. Solar energy is expected to play a major role in clean energy transitions in many countries. In India, the government has sanctioned 50 solar parks with a total capacity of around 38,000 megawatts across 12 states. 18 of these parks are already partially or fully completed. But solar projects require land. So there's a 2022 article in Nature which reports that 74% of India's solar parks are based on land which is of value for agricultural use or for natural ecosystems. This land has displaced farmers, leading to food insecurity and local conflicts. The term green grabs, you may have heard, has now been coined to describe this trend, which is you grab land from the poor for mitigating climate change. So is there an alternative to large solar parks? Yes, suggestions include decentralized solar panels on farmers' fields, which would mean better geographic distribution and land sparing. And we could make a similar case for decentralized hydro plants as versus large dams. The second criteria I had suggested for assessing solutions is that they should prioritize sectors that affect the most people. By this criteria, agriculture should have priority, as I've already mentioned, and then followed by urban informal workers. Now, agriculture, we need a mix of solutions. Some could be technical, heat-resistant crops. Some could be infrastructural, such as increasing the area under irrigation. But most importantly are institutional, which are seldom discussed and which I want to return to. Similarly, if you look at forests, in forest-rich countries like Indonesia and Brazil, the key challenges are deforestation and endangered agricultural food systems. I mean, Indonesia has the third largest area of tropical forests on the planet. But over the last half century, millions of Indonesian rainforests have been logged, burned, etc. So what is the solution? How far can we go by financial issue, just by finance and better coordination of government departments? So it brings me to the third criteria in judging climate just solutions. Namely, they need to be innovative and outside the box. So here I believe John Cardenas's paper provides a direction. And he talks, as he said, about moving from solutions that merely nudge individuals to behave in environmentally sensitive ways and which have limited impact, to more community-based solutions which could be transformative. This relates to moving from the I space, the nudge space, to the S space, which change in systems of rules, norms, and institutions. And he talks about the C frame, the community frame. His examples come all from social movements, and I just want to build on that and suggest that we cannot be confined to social movements, but we need to base these solutions in institutions which require everyday cooperation. So I'll share quickly just two examples from the Indian context, one from forests and the other from agriculture. Forest conservation, as we know, is key for climate mitigation. And according to TEEB, this is the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity, forests and commons provide 47% of the GDP of the poor in India, and vastly higher in Brazil. So community control over forests and commons can reduce both poverty and inequality. One of the most successful interventions in this regard, in fact, has been community forestry. So in the 1990s, what we saw was a substantial shift away from state management of forests to co-management, with over 50 countries pursuing partnerships with local communities. And India launched the Joint Forest Management Program in 1990, giving degraded forest land to communities to manage. What was the result? Within the first decade, 1991 to 2001, area under forest cover increased by 3.6 million hectares, whereas it was declining earlier. In 2000, there were 84,000 community forestry groups involving 8.4 million families, most from scheduled tribe and scheduled caste, the most socially disadvantaged. In addition, my own research shows that if you have a critical mass of women in forest management, it then further substantially increases outcomes, which would be one more woman in this group to make a critical mass of 33%. So this is a win-win for climate change and equity. And this is Ala Ostrom, which she was talking about, and the Brundtland report also talked about it in '87. The third and very quick example is from agriculture. I believe the most successful institutional experiment in this regard, again, involves a group approach. I'll take a minute, Kirit. Namely group farming. In the 2000s, Kerala launched all-women group farming as part of its anti-poverty program, Kudumshri. Here, groups of 4 to 10 women jointly lease in land, pool their labor and capital, and cultivate together. The women are economically poor, some are landless. They do organic farming and agroecology. Can you guess how many groups there are? There are 70,000 all-women groups involving 300,000 women in Kerala alone. So I surveyed a sample of group and individual farms. 95% of the individual farms were male-managed, and I found that group farms had 1.8 times the annual value of output per hectare and 5 times the profit per farm compared to individual family farms. Women's groups had also reclaimed water bodies, and they were more easily trained in climate-smart technology than individual farmers. Also, during the 2018 Kerala floods, which were caused, as we know, mostly by climate-induced excessive rains, but also some poor dam management, it was the Kudumshri groups that were able to recover best and help others recover. 87% of these farms survived COVID lockdown, which shows that, in fact, if you have climate change health effects, groups can deal with them much better than individuals. In other words, beyond technical and financial solutions, it is institutional solutions which are most likely to help reduce the adverse effect of climate change for the most disadvantaged. And although these examples fall broadly in the S space that Joan mentioned, they are different in scope. Social movements, which I call agitational collective action, are important, but they are sporadic. For sustainable change, we also need everyday forms of cooperation, and these institutions don't emerge spontaneously. They need state and civil society backup, and they need design principles. So to conclude, I would really welcome the 4 speakers to respond, especially to the last set of ideas about group and community-based solutions to climate change challenges in the context of their papers. So thank you.
Thank you, Veena. Thank you, Professor Agarwal. May I now request Professor Rogers.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished panelists and friends, as usual, we are hopelessly short of time, and Veena has already covered the contributions to these excellent presentations rather effectively. So I'm going to be extremely brief. In fact, all that I wanted to do was to try and set these presentations and actually the larger issue of climate change and equity within the broader narratives that you find in the literature. And actually, I picked up from a recent book on critical perspectives on agrarian structures and climate change, a notion of 4 narratives that you find in the literature. One is that climate change is just the latest challenge faced by the global economy, or global capitalism, if you prefer. Capitalism then generates solutions through the market, through innovation, through investment, through technology supported by public policy. So that's one way of interpreting what's going on. The second way of interpreting what's going on is we're facing an emergency, that catastrophe is around the corner, and that the doomsday scenario requires doomsday-type solutions and an authoritarian response. The third perspective is it's the distribution stupid. In other words, that the key to understanding what's going on and the key to the solutions is to try and examine the inequality of the impacts of both of climate change, the impacts in the sources of climate change and inequality in its impacts. And the fourth perspective is one of there are no solutions without a radical structural economic transformation, and that's where we should be paying our attention. Now these four perspectives are not entirely distinct, and the papers, the presentations clearly don't fit neatly into these boxes, but we can see that there's different emphases in the papers. If we start with the first about what can you do to save the existing model, then clearly the sorts of solutions that Aline has been talking about, the adaptations that are required in the policy framework, in the investment framework, that's about finding ways in which the existing model can survive. And Som's paper, to some extent, addresses the same issue with the technological solution, which may actually give more time, which may actually help to solve the problem. So that's one way of interpreting the presentations and the analysis. There's nobody really here who's looked at the doomsday model, although you hear a lot of that in discourses, especially NGO ecologist discourses will often lead you towards the feeling that you need an authoritarian solution, but there is no global authoritarian solution available, so that's probably a blind alley. The third issue of that the key is inequality, that takes us into a lot of very important issues, and Arjan's paper raised many of them. If you also look at the recent climate inequality report of the World Inequality Lab, Lucas Chancel and so on, the argument's very powerful that there are no solutions without redistribution, that the problem is actually inequality is the problem, that the climate change is basically the result of the pattern of distribution, that it's the rich who are responsible for the factors which are leading to climate change, and it's the poor that are suffering, and the way forward lies in taxing the rich and using those resources to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience among the poor. And that gives rise to this widespread lip service to climate justice, which you find in so many international declarations, including in the ILO. The problem really being that much of this is just lip service because there's no mechanism in place. Dealing with climate inequality is just as difficult as dealing with inequality overall. Both face powerful lobbies and powerful forces which undermine the possibility of effective interventions, which brings one naturally to the question of structural transformation. And much of the critical literature argues that requires mobilizations, it requires peasants and workers, land occupations, resistances, revolutionary movements of one sort or another, that without that sort of groundswell from the base, you are never going to generate the structural transformations that are needed. And you've got plenty of positive examples from around the world, the main problem being that their impact is essentially local. And I prefer to think of this in a somewhat different way, but I tend to work within the framework of the regulation school, the notion that there are development regimes of capital accumulation, growth regimes, which are built on an institutional framework. And here there's the linkages with what Juan and also Bina was saying is quite clear, that a stable development regime is built on a set of institutions that govern production, employment, and distribution. And without going into the details of that approach, crisis is crucial. That in the regulation model, change occurs through crisis. And as Ashwani, I guess, is not here, but as Ashwani said yesterday, everybody loves a good crisis. And as far as change of development regimes is concerned, the climate is perhaps the crisis which permits institutional change. In the past, those sorts of changes have occurred through war, through very deep economic crisis. Is the climate crisis sufficient to provide the mechanism by which institutional changes can occur, which will create a new path, a new development regime, which starts to overcome some of the impacts of climate change and offsets and reverses some of them? That's well, the jury is still out, but it's that sort of framework, it seems to me, that's needed in order to try and think beyond the existing economic and social systems towards the construction of alternatives, and what are the mechanisms by which they can come into being. And there I thought that there's a connection, direct or indirect, with Juan's presentation and the role of these intermediary forces which drive changes in social norms and institutions. And that, for me, sort of sets some of the agenda for future research. It's trying to look into some of those mechanisms which can generate the transformations which are needed. And as Imran said in his introduction, we're actually going to have an opportunity to continue that debate in the next session, because there is a panel which continues discussing these issues immediately after this one. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, fine. Thank you very much. I think we have spilled over the time significantly. Not much is left for tea. But let me just say 1 minute. I think we have had a very interesting session. We had presentations which emphasize the inequality of climate change, pointed out how not just the burden due to extreme events, but the continuing burden due to warming was also emphasized by Professor Somnathan. We had shown how important it is to have collective action, and yet at the same time how difficult it is to organize adaptation and the challenges that it faces. So I think this session has, I'm sure, given lots of food for thought. So now I think have some tea for your stomach. Thanks a lot.
This brings us to the end of the first plenary session of the day. Thank you to the chair and all the panelists and discussions. Yes, a group photograph, please, sir. A group photograph for the social media. Meanwhile, there are a few announcements. Yes, we do take break for tea. We have spilled over the time. Request you to move to your respective sessions. There is one change in the venue. Please note the thematic panel 6 on development of artificial intelligence role of platform and BPO workers is upstairs in seminar hall 2. Thematic panel 7, advancing women's work in Global South towards women's empowerment and gender equality, is taking place here in the multipurpose hall. Thematic panel 8, gender, social protection and child being in a changing world, sponsored by UNICEF, is in conference room 1 in the main building. The thematic panel 9 on climate change and livelihoods, experiences and policy options is taking place upstairs, seminar hall 1. And the main change that we have to note is thematic panel 10. The panel 10 on national multidimensional poverty index as a policy tool for advancing human development, being organized by Niti Aayog and UNDP, is taking place in conference room 2 in the adjacent building in IIC main. It was earlier slotted in We the People Hall, UN. It has now been shifted to conference room 2. The other venues, as mentioned in the program, remain the same, except for one change. The Niti Aayog and UNDP panel, which was slotted in We the People Hall, has now been shifted to conference room 2 in IIC Main. Request all of you to please pick up tea and move to your respective sessions. We begin with the parallel sessions of the day right after this. Thank you very much, and we look forward to our cooperation for the rest of the day. It is a packed day for today. Lifestyle panel is in private dining room. Thematic panel 12, Sustainable Agriculture and Livelihoods, is in Seminar Hall 3. The technical sessions of the day on education in Committee Room 3, and the gender equality session is in Terrace Pergola. Thank you very much.
I think the discussion